YouTube thing.
Okay, here we go. Hello, Global Theater. My name is Jerry Fielka. Today's November 19, 2024. I want to thank Rob Grant and his amazing podcast. I'm probably wrong about everything. It's an honor and a pleasure to be here with Ruth Galanter today in Venice, California. Thank you so much for your time and energy, Ruth.
Hey, and once you've been a politician, anytime somebody gives you a place to talk, you do
it. First question is, what is the best thing for a human being?
What is the best thing?
Yeah.
Life.
Life. I love that. That's Louis Buñuel says, long live the living. What's your favorite form of information? How it comes into you?
I ask questions. I ask everybody questions.
I ask questions. That's an amazing form of So why do you think humans collect or gather information?
Survival?
Yeah.
I mean, it goes on from there. We live in at the moment, we still live in a place where, for most of us, survival is not an issue, physical survival. But, you know, life is boring if you don't know anything. And how are you going to find out?
Do you think this need or want to collect information is more innate or more invented?
I think it's innate, but I think it's, unfortunately, many parents discourage it in their young children. I mean, you know, every little kid says, "Why, mommy? Why? You have to go to bed now. Why? You have to eat your vegetables. Why?" You know, my mother was a school teacher. She encouraged me. If I asked why, she told me why.
Nice.
And then I went to a school that, my mother organized her life around being able to keep me in that school, which has a reputation for Fieldston children are taught to ask why. And we asked why about everything.
It's great. Do thoughts create emotions?
That's a hard one. It works both ways.
Yeah. Fill in the blank. I don't know what I think until I
think about it.
Yeah. Well, a lot of people say, I don't know what I think until I do it. McLuhan says, I don't know what I think until I say it. Joan Didion says, I don't know what I think until I write it. So just to follow up on yours, is thinking more innate or more invented?
You're way out of my field of competence. I will tell you that in my endless conversations, since I've had a political career, every time there's an election or a controversial issue, people call me up and they say, "What are they thinking?" And I said, "Wrong question. The first question is, are they thinking?"
Are they thinking? That's brilliant.
And the answer, unfortunately, is frequently, no, they're not.
Yeah. Can humans think without language?
Should they? I think they do.
That's amazing. So no one said, well, let's go back for a second. Should they think without language? But can humans think without language? That's what I'm after. It's like me and you.
I have no idea.
Right. But me and you versus the wording on the question. So it's like, that's what I'm after, is people changing the verb or changing the wording. So, but let's go to yours. Should humans think without language? Then how would you answer that?
I think they do. I don't think it's a question of should. I mean, you know, should humans breathe? Well, they do.
That is good. See, this is about having fun, so I appreciate that.
Okay.
Okay.
Well, let me tell you that,
please.
you know, with only the slightest encouragement, or maybe none at all, I will put all of this into a political context for you.
That's what I'm after it. Okay. So here's Chomsky. Language is not just words. It's a culture, a tradition, a unification of community, a whole history that creates what a community is. What do you do when language doesn't work? When language breaks down, what do you do?
You know, I'm sorry I didn't bring it with me, but one of my ways of working off tension or boredom is to write rhymed couplets. And most of them are silly, but every once in a while, There's one that the latest one I'm particularly proud of actually has 3 verses, but I only remember one.
Yeah.
You know the story of Horton hatches the egg. Dr.
Dr.
Seuss.
Seuss. Okay.
Yeah, Horton promises the mommy goose that he'll sit on the egg. He said what he meant what he said, and he said what he meant. An elephant's faithful 100%. So a friend of mine describes reading this to his 2-year-old granddaughter, and the intermediate generation, the kid's father, compliments Grandpa, who happens to be a writer. So of course he knows how to do this stuff. So my friend George was telling me this whole story, and I thought, well, I can do that too. He's not the only writer I know. So I wrote, most of the time you should say what you mean in good times and bad times and times in between. But once in a while, it's good to recall the best thing to do is say nothing at all. And the next verse, which of course I don't remember, goes on to explain all the things you can do. Raise your eyebrows, shrug your shoulders, make faces. You cannot be quoted if you didn't mutter the wonderful zinger you were tempted to utter.
Yeah.
And when you're in politics, you got to be careful about being quoted.
Very. You answered that well. That was beautiful. And your observations of humans in general, are we more thinking beings or more feeling beings?
Feeling.
Yeah.
I mean, I said earlier that the question I always ask the people who ask me about politics is, were they thinking? No, they weren't most of the time.
Yeah.
I mean,
most people, 80% of people say, I think we're more feeling beings. And so it's funny because I think that we invented the words feeling and thinking, but you can't separate them. They're really integrated. And Bridget Bardot says, when I make love, I don't think. And it's like, good luck. How do you turn your brain off? Like people who meditate, they go, okay, now think about not thinking. And there's a bumper sticker on this street on a car, and it says, don't believe everything you think.
Oh,
And
I've seen
I
that.
said, why don't you put don't believe everything you feel?
How about just don't believe everything?
2 questions from Alan Turing in the 50s. One, is thinking a function of the soul?
Now, first, you're going to have to define the soul to be able to answer that. I haven't got a clue.
Yeah.
And you know, frankly, it's not something that concerns me much.
Yeah.
Thinking is important in all the work that I've ever done. I also think it's fun.
Yeah.
So I like asking questions. I like finding out how things work. I remember vividly in nursery school, I grew up in New York. I was not too far from a railroad line. So we used to go down and wave to the engineers, and sometimes they'd wave back. And one day in nursery school, they told us we're going to go on a field trip. So here's the field trip. Picture a train, and you picture a train car. All of the cars look exactly the same front and back, except one, the engine. It's the only one that can go only in one direction. How do you turn the engine around? I was fascinated by this at age 3 or 4, and they took us to someplace. Nobody remembers this but me. I can't find out where it was, but it was called a roundhouse because there was a house over it.
Yeah.
Basically a turntable. You drive the train you drive the engine, you just unhook it from all these symmetrical cars, and you drive it onto this thing, turn it around, point it the other way, and hook the cars back up. I thought this was the coolest thing in the world. And I can't believe nobody else remembers it, but I've asked everybody I could think of.
That's good. You kind of answered a question that's coming up, but the second Turing question is, can machines think?
I guess we're going to find out.
Yeah.
Machines can calculate, but that's not quite the same.
Yeah. Do you more pursue happiness or more pursue meaning?
Are they different?
Yeah, you're answering a question with a question. You win, Ruth. That's what this is all about. But I got it from Viktor Frankl's Man's Search for Meaning. He says, happiness doesn't tend to last, meaning does.
What does he say about the recollection of happiness?
Yeah, it's a good question. I don't know the book that well, but that's really good. I'm glad what you're doing is you're really doing what I'm after is inventing. This is McLuhan's main thing: invent new questions and new metaphors. We're gonna have the old ones around. Does the brain more detect consciousness or create it? Like, is consciousness bubbling and we're detecting it, or are we creating
I don't think we're thinking about it.
it? It's just happening.
Well, yeah. I mean, are you conscious? I guess if you're alive and breathing, you must be conscious. But,
Yeah.
Let me give you an example. When somebody stuck a knife in my head to try to kill me, there are large parts of the experience I remember in much more detail than I would like to, and other parts that I don't. And some parts came back to me afterwards. I didn't remember them till I saw something in the newspaper. Or I had a procedure when I was in the hospital and I complained because it really hurt. And they said, gee, it didn't bother you last time. And I said, what last time? So apparently, this is your consciousness thing. They hauled me into the emergency room, which I do not remember anything about.
Yeah.
Zero. The last thing I know was somebody in my house told me we were going to UCLA. I don't remember the ambulance ride. I don't remember the ER. I don't remember anything till I came to after surgery. And I don't know what day that was. But obviously, I was conscious while I was in the ER because they explained to me, they gave me directions, and I followed directions. Turn your head, open your mouth, whatever it was. I don't remember any of that.
Wow.
So was I conscious or
Yeah.
not conscious?
Yeah.
I don't know how to
Yeah,
answer that.
that's the memory question coming up. Let's do this one. What's faster, speed of light or speed of thought?
Light.
So here is Audre Lorde, the poet. You can't dismantle the master's house using the master's tools. Yvonne Rainer said, her colleague, you can if you expose the tools. What new tool do you suggest?
I can't help you with that. You're
But
in a realm of thought
yeah,
that is I can't say it's alien to me. It's just unfamiliar. I don't think about stuff like that
right.
because I'm busy.
Right, I understand, but let's whittle it down. Basically, I'm saying, what tool do you most gravitate towards?
Asking questions.
Perfect. What toy do you suggest?
What toy?
Yeah.
Well, I'm very fond of the pencil.
I love that's one
How
of my
else am I going to write these damn couplets when I'm in the middle of a council meeting?
Oh, I love it. So the tool was asking questions. That is beautiful. Okay. What do you worry about when you go to bed at night?
Whether somebody's going to break in the house and stick a knife in my head. Been there, done that. Do not want to do it again.
Yeah. Okay, McLuhan learned from a poet that artists are the antenna of the race. And let's not even just say artists, let's say politicians, everyone kind of as in their job, they're revealing the hidden psychic effects of our inventions, like what the inventions are really doing to us. And we ignore that. We generally ignore seeing the hidden deeper meaning in things. Why do we ignore looking deeper into things?
Some people are interested in complexity and some people are not.
Yeah.
If you got a lot on your plate, you have a couple of kids to support, you
Yeah.
got to get them ready for school. You don't have time for all this complexity.
Yeah.
And I mean, that's what leads parents to turn off kids' curiosity. I don't have time for this. You have to go to school, I have to go to work. Get your clothes on, don't give me an argument, whatever it is.
Yeah. Do artists have moral obligation?
Everybody has
Everybody
moral
does.
obligation.
Are you more afraid of new ideas or more afraid of old ideas?
I'm not afraid of any ideas if I'm allowed to ask questions
So
about it.
that is so, you are my hero. Okay.
You notice a recurrent theme here.
Duh, I love it.
So I'll tell you a story that at least
Please.
makes this a little more fun. So after I retired from the council a little over 20 years ago, well, when I was bleeding on the bed when the guy tried to kill me, I promised myself that if I got out of this alive, I would start traveling. And I did. And so it turns out my mother traveled a lot, but I had done very little until after all this happened. So years later, I think after I retired, I go on a trip to we have to get rid of that.
Yeah, just
okay.
Sorry.
So I'm on a trip to Egypt. It's a tour group. They're like 15 or 16 people. Nobody else from New York, where I grew up. Nobody else from California. One guy who used to live in New York and by then lived in Florida. And maybe 2/3 of the way through the trip, the little minivan is barreling down the highway next to the Nile, and over my shoulder, across the aisle, I hear somebody say, "I bet you went to Fieldstone, didn't you?" And I, of course, burst out laughing and turned around and said, "Yes, I did. How did you know?" And he said, "I worked for the College Board. I know all those schools." When I got home and told this story to several people here in LA who also knew the school, somebody said, "Well, how did he know?" And I didn't even think about it. I said, "Well, I know how I knew." And she said, "Question authority." He could tell in the middle of Egypt.
In the middle of Egypt.
I was on a trip to Turkey with a bunch of amazing. It was also a small group, about 15 people, I think. Former, mostly retired teachers, clergy, and elected officials. And there was one guy there who actually had a degree in education, which should make you very nervous about education schools, who got very angry with me. And I finally said to him, "What do you dislike so much? What have I done?" He said, "You ask all those questions." And I resisted. Remember, sometimes it's best to say nothing at all.
Yeah.
I hadn't written that yet, but I knew. So I resisted saying, "And you dare call yourself an educator?" I mean, for crying out loud.
That's the well, not the as McLuhan says, the cliche that turned into an archetype. When I grew up in Flint, Michigan, my parents says, if you don't have nothing to say, nice to say, don't say anything at all.
Yeah, that's different.
But they also were encouraging me to be curious and constantly ask questions. So sometimes a question comes off a little like not as a nicety. But Dorothy, or either Dorothy Parker or Roosevelt's wife said, if you don't have anything nice to say, sit next to me.
I think it was Dorothy Parker.
Dorothy, yeah.
My kind of woman. I wish I had known her.
Yeah. Now you answered this, but I'm going to ask it anyways. Can you conjure up your earliest memory ever, or one of them?
I don't know what my earliest memory is. Some things from my early childhood I know because my mother told me about them.
Right.
So I don't know if I really remember them. I mentioned the turntable from nursery school. I have a bunch of nursery school memories. I remember them. And, a lot of it, now that I think about it, was about how things work. We had clay class.
Yeah.
So we got to make little things out of clay. And they actually had a kiln in the building. So they were going to be fired and glazed. And I made this rabbit, which I still have. And it's a fat little thing with long ears that stick off. And they explained to me, I don't remember exactly who it was, but somebody explained to me why I had to hollow it out. How old are you in nursery school? 3 years old?
Wow.
Something like that, 4 years old? And why do you have to hollow it out? Because when you put it in the
kiln
oven, kiln, the thick part takes longer to dry out than the thin part. So you have to thin it out so it will
dry or it'll harden evenly,
so it can cook evenly.
Yeah.
And So, I mean, there's that one.
Yeah.
There's, I'm sure there's another one from there.
Is memory more a curse or more a blessing?
Depends on the memory.
Yeah.
I mean, I give you my stabbing in the head to give you both.
Yeah. Tell me someone within your immediate family who had an impact on you, kind of like a role model, and what was that impact specifically?
Well, my mother, of course, was the most influential. My father died when I was 6.
Age 6?
Age 6 and
Wow.
2 weeks. It was right after my birthday. So I basically was raised by my mother and um, her sister's family and another family who were neighbors, um, and various uncles and aunts. I've lost your
But
question.
besides curiosity, what else did you get from your mom? A kind of a trait or an
Brains.
brains.
My mother was very, very smart. She unfortunately could never afford to go to college, and she regretted that forever. But not enough to, when she retired from teaching on her 65th birthday, I said, why don't you get a BA? You got nothing to do now. You have a pension. You have plenty of time. She wouldn't do it. I don't know why not.
What age did she live till?
100.
Okay, so 2 questions in that regard. I know it's stupid, but do you think her longevity in life was more DNA or a little more DNA or a little more lifestyle choice?
DNA.
DNA. So do you think your brain's being smart is a little more DNA from your mom or a little more lifestyle choice on your own?
This is I'm very fond of saying I come by all my eccentricities genetically.
Genetically, yeah.
And so one thing we learned after I got knifed in the head is that I have my mother's cardiovascular system, not my father's. My father died at 42. So, and all the men in his family tended to die young. My mother was the longest lived in her family, and that probably was um, an accident.
Genetic, a little
Yeah,
more
probably
genetic,
was
yeah.
genetic.
But she did have a good lifestyle choice, did she?
Yeah, I mean, the reason she did smoke when I was young, I guess my father probably did too. But I put some of this together later because I was little when my father died. But when he died, all of the other men in the family of about the same age, of course, went running off to their doctors and got checked out, which makes sense. I mean,
Yeah,
you don't expect them to die at
yeah.
42. So I had 2 uncles, Leo. My uncle Leo, my mother's brother-in-law, lived around the corner, and he must have gone to the doctor because sometime over the next couple of years, I remember him coming home, and I wasn't there for it. The story was he came home and he said to his family, the doctor said to him, Leo, you will lose 40 pounds and you will stop smoking or you will die. So he was going to stop smoking. So my aunt, who was a very good wife, said she'd quit smoking as well. And she did, except that she would come around the corner to my mother's apartment and say, hey, Vera, have you got a cigarette? And my aunt and uncle had plenty of money. We had essentially none.
Wow.
My mother somehow managed to give me a very privileged upbringing on no money at all. And so she got so irritated at her wealthier sister at bumming cigarettes that she quit smoking.
Amazing. So, same question, Ruth, and thank you so much. This is really fun. I appreciate it. Someone outside your immediate family who had an impact on you, kind of like a role model, and what was that impact?
Well, there probably were a lot of people. I mean, over the
Like
course.
one that kind of stands out.
Well, I'll tell you my favorite story out of high school. I started reading detective stories. I thought it was in high school, but I realized later it was in elementary school. Freddie the Detective, 2nd grade or 4th grade or something, and
Yeah.
Emil and the Detectives. So there I am in English seminar senior year in high school, which is you had to be permitted into that particular thing. And we read a lot in the course of a year. When I got to college and somebody said, "Oh, you should take great books," I read the syllabus, I'd read them all in high school. So it was a heavy load English class. And one day, one of my friends caught me reading a Perry Mason mystery. And she said, "Oh, Ruth, you shouldn't be reading that." And I said, "Why not?" She said, what should I be reading? She should be reading literature. And so I don't remember what I said back to her, but once a month, we were each required to meet with our English teachers for a conference. And it was basically designed for kids who were having difficulty. But in order to not have any stigma, everybody had to do it. So you go in and the ritual is, are you keeping up with your reading? Yes, I am. Do you have any questions? No, I don't. It goes on like that. And I forget what the rest of the questions were.
Yeah.
And so toward the end, the last question is, "And do you have any questions?" And I said, "Well, yeah, I do." And I told him the story of Barbara, who said I was not to read this. And this wonderful man drew himself up with his best professorial, hands clasped in front of him. And he leaned toward me and he said, "You must never allow anyone to tell you what you may read." And every time I tell it, I can feel the grin come over my face. So I said, "Thank you very much. I'll see you next month." And I beat it the hell out of there.
What was the word though? I missed. Grim? The grim over my face. Oh, the
grin.
Oh, I was happy because he disproved
told me.
Yeah, he disproved.
He said
advice,
I could read whatever I wanted and don't let anybody. Well, not only has this, I found out recently, turned up in a memoir by one of my high school classmates, which means I've been telling that story for a very long time. But I've discovered its lasting impact on me is the flip side. People, the expression now is "must read."
Yeah.
And every time somebody says "must read," my response is, "Oh yeah, try and make me."
I do that "must read" on my emails. I'm gonna drop word.
It.
How about this? I welcome your reactions.
There's
or I suggest you.
No,
I mean, the fact that
I thought this was great. I hope you like it too.
Right, but that's again coloring their.
Okay,
yeah.
so you say,
check this.
I'd be interested in what you think of this.
Yeah, that's what I mean, say. Yeah,
but
yeah, because it's evident you're passing on. You're not really passing any suggestion on because you go, "Hey, this really sucks. Will you read it?" Because
you can even say that, but
right.
the what this gentleman, his name was Albert Glenroe, taught me was, what you read is your business and nobody else's.
Yeah.
And
that's good.
That was very valuable advice.
It was so good. I loved that you answered it that way because it's very specific and it was long lasting. Okay. Did your parents raise you a particular religion?
No. They were both raised Jewish. They were both, each of them was the last kid born abroad. They came here as small children. My mother was an infant. My father must have been about 5.
Yeah.
Both raised in Eastern European Jewish families. My mother just had a brother a year older till he was hit and killed by a drunk driver. And she found out early on, this is early 20th century, Bayonne, New Jersey, when you go to synagogue, the women have to sit upstairs. My mother didn't like that. Then this is Jewish, traditional Eastern European Jewish, Ashkenazi Jewish. Then she found out her brother was going to have a bar mitzvah, but she was not. Why? Because she was a girl. She didn't like that either. So that's pretty much what did it. Yeah. So by the time they had me, I don't know my father's story because my mother's side of the family, the Jewishness is basically gone.
Yeah.
I know more about Jewish than any of my cousins, my generation, but most of it I picked up later. She did tell me. It took me years to ask, but I was actually raised in one of those secular humanist religions called the ethical culture movement,
Oh,
which is just what it sounds like.
yeah.
It's basically an effort to cultivate an ethical life, but without dealing with the issue of God, and there's no doctrine. Um,
Do you pray?
no,
If God exists, what would you like God to say to you after you die?
I would like God to apologize
I get that answer.
for war, for
Yeah.
death, for
So I don't mean to laugh.
no,
Okay.
no, I know.
Do evil people exist, or does
Yes.
evil use people as a vehicle?
Well, that I don't know, but what difference does it make? Once they're evil, it doesn't matter how they got there.
How they got there. Okay, here's the really hidden question: is how do you advise someone to deal with an enemy? Let me set it up. Alan Watts says, if you acknowledge your enemy, you empower them. Coppola said, stole from the mob and the samurai, keep your friends close and your enemies closer. JFK said, forgive your enemy, but don't forget their name. And Fellini says, I need an enemy. So it's a lot of thoughts. The basic question is, how do you advise someone to deal with an enemy? But first, how would you react to Alan Watts? If you acknowledge your enemy, you empower them.
Depends what you acknowledge. I mean, if you want to survive your enemy, it also depends what kind of enemy you're talking about. I mean, people who want to kill you, I think if you don't acknowledge it, you'll die. I mean, it's as simple as that. If they want to force you out of political office, what you want to do is outsmart them. It's not but that's not, I in my last 2 years in office, let's fill in, because not everybody seeing this will know this, but this episode of being stabbed in the head occurred in the middle of my first campaign for the city council, when I was challenging the president of the city council. And I'll spare you the whole long story, but everybody in the Venice community, including me, was convinced that this was a political hit, because we could identify.
It was so evident that the cards lined up that it was.
Well,
it could have been that, but in the long run, you figured it wasn't, or you?
Oh no! In the long run, I remain convinced that it was.
Oh, that it was. Okay,
but it doesn't matter at this point. They I've almost forgotten why I was telling you the story. I have forgotten why I was.
But it was like, how do you advise someone to deal with an enemy?
Okay, well, in a situation like that one, I fought back.
Yeah.
I mean, what else are you going to do? You're going to roll over and die? I wouldn't give them the satisfaction. Now, at the other end of my political career, 4 terms later, I'm in my 4th term, and my second round of being reapportioned. Every 10 years, they rearrange the district lines. And the legislative, and by this time we had term limits as well. So when the last reapportionment happened, I was going to be leaving in a year anyway because of term limits. One of my new colleagues engineered the passage of a motion that after the reapportionment, we should all move to our new boundaries immediately. And without going through all the details, this meant that my district was now on the other side of the city. And there was a perfectly good reason for that. The only reason for insisting we move immediately, giving my new constituents no choice at all in the matter, was that this new colleague, a euphemism, a new fellow council member, and I think she got talked into it. I don't think she thought this up by herself. That's giving her too much credit. But basically, the idea was to get me to quit. And why did they want me to quit? So they could appoint the guy who was going to run the next year, and he'd be able to run as the incumbent. So do I consider the woman who wanted me to move an enemy? You bet I do. What did I do? Nah, I
Yeah.
didn't quit.
Yeah.
And my year representing a 71% Latino district in the Northeast Valley was a huge hit. They haven't had representation like that since.
Yeah. Did you get that, what I would say, standing your ground, courage, whatever you want to call that? Did you get it more from the way your mom raised you, or on your own?
Uh,
That sort of
no,
standing.
probably. Well, it's probably a mixture.
Yeah.
Uh, my mother was much more careful because she was a school teacher in a very political era, very political environment. Um, so she was very nervous about. She needed the income. I mean, she could
Yeah.
not afford,
Yeah.
literally, could not afford to um, be defiant.
Yeah.
And so I don't know what she would have done if she could have. But by the time I got to be an adult, just because of the era in which I got to be an adult, um, I get mad when I think people are doing things that are
Yeah.
unjust. And I'm a child of the '60s.
Yeah.
The Greensboro sit-in was my freshman year in college. I
Yeah.
watched the '50s turn into the '60s
Yeah.
in Michigan, by the way.
Me too. We're both Michiganders. So this is the follow-up. Nassim Taleb said games were created to give non-heroes the illusion of winning. In real life, we don't know who wins or loses, but we can tell who a hero is. My friend said, but villains, yeah, I'm not saying these things like I agree or disagree. They're just sort of
Yeah.
prompts. But my friend said, well, villains don't think they're bad. They want control. Heroes want freedom. And Gregory Bateson says, when the criminal gets caught, does he go, whoa, my criminal skills weren't up to snuff that day? Or does he go, I did something morally and socially wrong? So again, it's a lot of prompts. The basic question is, does punishment work?
It probably depends on what the crime was, what the punishment was, and the individual in question.
Yeah.
I mean, I'll give you another example out of my political career. I have forgotten what Mark Ridley Thomas did that pissed off Council President Ferraro, but there was something.
Yeah.
So Ferraro, who had the power to appoint us all to committees, removed Mark from the committees he wanted and gave him other committees. Mark's response was he did a bang up job in the new committees. It pissed off Ferraro, and there was nothing he could do about it. That to me is a very creative response.
Yeah.
Partly to having been pushed around, but also to the job. I mean,
Yeah.
it's the city hall is different today from what it was like then.
Yeah.
But there are all kinds of
Yeah.
responses, and I mean, look at the bunch of people who just went to jail, political people. Has any of them ever said I did something wrong?
Yeah.
I,
Yeah, it's a question I've been trying to refine because when I go, does punishment work? A lot of people go, no, because they're talking about the prison industrial complex. They're kind of putting it there. But, there's that attitude that, with I'm raising kids, people say, you don't go, don't do that. You go, wouldn't you rather play with this, instead of, so I'm still working on the wording on that question. Does punishment work? It doesn't quite work. But anyways, that was good. James Joyce was the first projectionist in Dublin 100 years ago. He basically checked out. He said, this is stupid. Why should I go inside a building and see a movie of a tree when I can go outside and see a real tree? Years later, Faulkner said sometimes the best fiction is more true than journalism. Why do we have to recreate things in order to get them? Why do we have to go to a theatrical play of people acting out life? Why don't we just live life?
that's a really good question. I don't think I know the answer, but I'm gonna try. I was an English major, and I am convinced, people, because I grew up to be an elected official, surprising the hell out of everybody who knew me as a child, including me. People are always saying, well, did you study political science? Did you study sociology? No, I studied literature and drama. And they
Right.
were the best preparation for doing a job because they both of each of them gives you a chance to understand other people
Yeah.
and you know to get outside of yourself and understand
Yeah.
at some level, visceral or otherwise, what makes people tick. And
Yeah.
if you're going to influence events, especially if you don't plan to shoot people, it helps to have some notion of what makes people tick.
Yeah.
I mean, one of the great evolutionary points in my adult life, my political life, was when I finally caught on that everybody in LA wants the city to be exactly the way it was the day he arrived here. And once you understand that, people's anxieties over density or traffic or, you know,
Yeah.
name it, crime, whatever it is, they all make sense.
Yeah.
And not only do they make sense, but it makes it a little easier to deal with how to respond.
How to respond.
You know, sometimes sarcasm is not the best answer. I had one guy, what tipped me off was there's this very large condominium development not far from here called Villa Marina Condos,
Yeah.
which I know you're familiar with. And one day I was invited to come to a board meeting of one of the units within Villa Marina. So I go off to this board meeting. There's 5 or 6 people there. And 2 of them in particular they didn't actually do this at me, but, you know, they kind of metaphorically did. One guy said to me nicely, but the content wasn't so nice, but he was nice about it. He said, you know, where I used to live, they would never tolerate this. Why does LA tolerate all this density? I said, where'd you used to live? Aspen. Aspen's a little town for crying out
Yeah.
loud, and half the population is part-time. Oh, I said. Now, he never asked, he never, obviously never thought about what was here before the condominium he's living in was built. There was a whole neighborhood of single-family houses there
Yeah.
that got destroyed. But since he wasn't here for that part,
Yeah.
that didn't bother him.
Yeah.
And that was when I realized if it looked this way when you got here, you're okay with it. But if you got here and then it changed, you don't like it. And then I realized nobody takes change easily. That's
Yeah.
why, you know, all us old folks complain about our aches and pains. It's
Yeah.
not fair.
Well, your word that stood out earlier that I think you're touching on is understanding. That nothing exists on its own. It's a relationship to its, you know, it's like what ecology is the organism's relationship with the environment around it, you know. So it's like figure ground. Okay, so what was the tipping point, Ruth, for you to pursue going from literature and drama? Well, first of all, let's say the tipping point. Where did you go? Well, I want to study literature and drama in college. Where's that tipping point?
Well, I mentioned that I started college when the 50s turned into the 60s. Here's what happened. I went to this very competitive progressive private school in New York. My college advisor at the school said, you're not going to get into Harvard because there are too many of you applying. We'll get you into any of the other ones without problem, but you won't get into Harvard. But I insisted. I didn't want to go to an
To
all.
study what?
Oh, it didn't matter at that point.
You
I just
didn't know yet at
no,
that
no,
point?
I had no idea what I was going to do.
Okay.
Everything in my life has been a surprise to me. I had no idea I would ever run for office. And
Yeah.
when I finally ran, it took me a long while to realize I was going to win. And if I won, I had to do the job. I hadn't even thought about driving downtown 3 days a week.
Oh my God.
And then the guy stuck the knife in my head and that changed the calculus again. But so Harvard turned me down as predicted. And I'm, huff. I didn't want to go to Wellesley or Smith. So I said, I'm going to the University of Michigan where my father went.
Oh
That
my
was all I
God.
knew about it was my father went there and it was big. And so I went to Michigan at the exact perfect time, for which, as much as I hate Harvard for being snotty, I am very grateful to them. They changed my life by turning me down. So I went to a school where there were lots of people smarter than I. There were lots of people who had never lived in New York and didn't see anything wrong with that. There were even people who liked football, which I did not and still do not. But so what? And um, and then the 60s happened. And I actually, in high school, I had been on a demonstration for integration to Washington. I found a leaflet. There's
Civil rights. You were
yeah,
tapped into
ethical
that before you hit
cultures.
Ann Arbor.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. So I was tuned into that. I
Yeah.
said to my mother, "Look at this leaflet. Should I go?" She said, "Oh, I think you should," and I did.
Wow.
Um, and then the lunch counter sit-in happened my freshman year. Suddenly, college students were going to change the world. Wow, I'm a college student. Maybe I could change the world. But instead of marching around on the picket line, since see, I have a very literal mind. You have to be careful what you say to me because I listen to it. So the pitch was, we're going to boycott Kresge's.
Yeah.
Now, as I understand it, boycott means you don't shop there. So I had this huge argument with my boyfriend because I'm running around my dorm trying to get people to not shop there. And he's trying to tell me that's not what you should be doing. You should be out marching on the picket line. That I should have paid more attention. That difference turns out to have shaped, took a long time. It took many years for me to realize I was right. He wasn't, even if he was a boy and I was a girl. Um, so then this is also the heyday of college student civil rights and then the anti-war movement.
Yeah.
So I get all caught up in that. I still don't know what to do with my life. I figured out halfway through, certainly by sophomore year, maybe in my freshman year, one thing I never want to do is write a dissertation. And I have never changed my mind about that. That's too much deference to the whims of somebody called your thesis advisor. And later, when one of my friends was telling me about, much later, about advising her PhD students, it reinforced my feeling. I would not have wanted, she's my friend. I loved her. I would not have wanted her telling me what was what with my arguments.
Right.
So I got out of the honors program. I got off the PhD in English track halfway through college. Still had no idea what to do. Followed my boyfriend to New Haven while he went to law school, got married, sat in on law school classes. As my mother predicted, I got bored with working. I had the absolutely best graduate student wife job in the place, but it was boring. And so I got a master's degree in urban planning because it would finish up at the right time. And
But let's just go on that for a second. What was it about urban planning that made you go, well, I could go with that?
oh, well, I grew up in New York. Remember my train,
Jane
the
Jacobs?
turntable? I like knowing how things work. So I like knowing how
Right.
cities work. So, and there weren't that many 2-year programs. I did not know about public health at that point. I don't know if I would have taken planning anyway
Yeah.
because I liked cities. I liked my
Yeah.
neighborhood.
That's cool. Did you know Jane Jacobs, or did you
No, I
follow?
read the book. That's
Yeah.
part of why I wanted to go to urban planning school. Because
Really?
she,
Jane
oh
Jacobs
yeah,
was a influence, yeah.
yeah,
Did you
well,
see Citizen Jane, the
no,
documentary? Anyways, beautiful. Because she made an experimental film with Marshall McLuhan.
oh,
Jane Jacobs and Marshall McLuhan. That's like what? So, anyways, you go into urban planning.
okay.
Now,
So,
we're,
no,
yeah,
wait.
go
So I
ahead.
go
Yeah.
into urban planning in New Haven, Connecticut, which is small enough that when this happens and then that happens, it's not hard to connect the dots. So by halfway through my planning program, I already knew planners do not plan. planners cover for the people who make the decisions.
Wow.
And so that doesn't leave you anywhere. But I have never worked for a planning department as a result. I couldn't
Yeah.
bear it. We moved back to New York. I had a job briefly with a state agency. I was so bored. I went home and wept every night. I was just bored. So finally, my husband agreed, okay, you can quit. And then he got me a series of short-term things that were basically advocacy jobs of one sort or another. I did a couple of months stint writing bargaining demands for the City of New York Welfare Workers Union, which at the time was an independent union that worked with the client organization, the Welfare Rights Organization. And my husband explained to me, the one thing you need to know as you start this job is that in labor law, the union can bargain only over things that affect workers. So you have to translate all these client demands into worker demands. So I did. That was interesting. What else did I do? Then I got a job with somebody out of the student movement who now had a gig analyzing New York City hospitals. So he managed to sneak me onto the payroll to find it for a month, to find out how New York City decides where to put a hospital. We all had so much fun. He got the guy whose foundation funded it to put me on and then put a few other people on. So I did that for a couple of years. Then I busted up with my husband, moved across the country, and wound up writing a newsletter. A lawyer I had met through my husband's job was now running a health-related law office at UCLA. I needed a job, so it's a long story. We don't have time for that.
Yeah, but that's.
But I found him. They needed a plaintiff for something, and a doctor plaintiff. And so I went along while they talked to some guy, and he'll turn them down. So on the way back, I said, "What happened?" He said, "He turned us down." I said, "Well, why don't you call up the health radicals and say, you're so radical, I need this." And they said, what does that mean? Well, we don't know any. I said, I know them all. Tell me what you want. So they told me what they wanted. I said, I met him on my travels out here. We'll look up his phone number when we get back to the office. He loved it. I knew he would love it. Then I said, as we were getting out of the car back at UCLA, don't you guys have a newsletter? I mean, these people should be beating down your door, and there's more humping. Turns out the funding agency wanted them to do a newsletter. They're a bunch of lawyers. They don't know how to do a newsletter.
Wow.
So they hired me half-time, and I translated legalese into English for social workers and welfare rights organizers and medical students.
So you're a writer in a lot of ways.
Funny you should say that.
Because you started lit in drama, then you go off, and then you sort of rewind.
Yeah, and then, but while I was working there, I was rooming with two guys, one of whom was an aspiring screenwriter. And I remember sitting over dinner one day with the two guys and saying to Arthur, I can't tell you how much I admire your commitment to being a writer. I could never do that. And he looked at me and he said, excuse me, Miss Galanter, what did you say your job is? Oh, somehow I hadn't put it together. Oh.
Talk about tipping point. Okay, that's pretty good, because then not to cut you off, but is there a tipping point to go into politics then? I mean, you're in politics. I shouldn't say politics, and running for office.
Well, here's the trajectory.
Yeah, there we go.
So I write this thing, and after the first couple of months, it's a little bit boring. I'm very proud of it. I mean, I look back at it. It's a wonderful newsletter.
Yeah.
And they, of course, killed it the instant I walked out the door. And now they write one, you have to be a PhD to understand what they're talking about, which sort of defeats the purpose. What finally led me out of the job was somebody, one of the guys I was living with, the third one moved out, and the two of us were a couple. remembered that we had just in California had just enacted a coastal commission. And so he and I started showing up in front of this new agency with various things to say. My thing in the first go around, well, mostly we were after affordable housing, but my thing early on was one of the virtues of this law is you don't have to be an adjacent property owner in order to have your views taken seriously. But how are you going to know that there's something to have a view on if you don't require them to put notice on the property?
Yeah.
Thank you very much, Miss Galanter. I kept coming back, and finally they did it. And so now there's notice. So if somebody's about to build a multi-story building across your pathway to the beach, you can find out. So we did that. That's a long story unto itself, the upshot of which is I eventually got appointed by Jerry Brown in his first term as governor to serve on the Regional Coastal Commission. So now I'm an appointed official.
Yeah.
And I did that for several years, and then for various reasons that ended, and I worked for a couple of other state environmental protection agencies as a freelance consultant. And then the money was drying up, and the bunch of my friends in Venice were trying to find a candidate. They had called me 4 years earlier, and then the district line was in the wrong place. Well, wouldn't you like to move? No. So I didn't run in 83. 87, the lines had changed, and now I was in the district. I was out of a job, or about to be out of a job. I hadn't a clue what I wanted to do with my life. I was very annoyed at the incumbent, the president of the city council, who was not adequately protecting our last remaining wetlands. And so when a group of people started looking for somebody to run, I said, well, I'll think about it. And I went off and talked to various people who assured me I couldn't possibly win. People who knew, elected officials. Well, the first question, I talked to 3 of them. It was the same routine. First question, how much money can you raise? Probably not very much. You can't win. Second, so then I say, well, if I decide to run anyway, will you support me? Howard Berman said yes, who was, I don't think he was in Congress yet. He was still in the legislature. He said yes for reasons I had helped him out with something once. Mel Levine, my assemblyman, said, well, okay. If Howard says okay, okay. And then I got to Tom Hayden, who was I guess he was also in the assembly by then. I knew Tom from college
in Ann Arbor.
In Ann Arbor.
Yeah.
And so I get to Tom, and he said, well, you can't win. And I said, yeah, I know, but will you support me anyway? And he said, no. And I said, what do you mean, no? He said, well, look, you're just the kind of candidate that his new group, when I knew him, he was SDS, Students for Democratic Society. Yeah. By this time, SDS has imploded long since, and he's now got something called Campaign for Economic Democracy, which I was not a part of. You're just the kind of candidate CED would like to support, but we can't afford to support somebody who can't possibly win. So I said, if you were me, what would you do? First I said, if I don't run, she's going to win. And he said, yeah, it's really a shame. And I said, well, if you were me, what would you do? And that stumped him. He had to stop and think for a second. And the way I could tell was he said, what would I do? Now, that's the kind of answer you give only when you're playing for time. I said, yeah, what would you do? He said, I wouldn't run. I thank you for your time. And I got up and left. That may have been what kicked me over.
That's the tipping point, isn't that amazing?
It might be.
That might be. I love how it might be. I asked Tom.
Well, I'm not sure.
Yeah, well,
so,
no, that's
so
good.
I go back and we start up this campaign, and the postscript to the Tom Hayden story is that comes the night of the primary, and the way this works is, I don't know if all your viewers know this, the way it works is in the primary election, you could have any number of people, and the top two vote getters, if the top vote getter gets less than 50%, there's a runoff between the top two. So my only job was to come in second. The incumbent, who had hundreds of thousands of dollars and every endorsement imaginable, excuse me, she would clearly come in first. There were, I think, 5 or 6 of us running against her. So our job collectively was to keep her under 50%, and my job was to come in second, which I did. And collectively, we kept her at 42%, which is really embarrassing for an incumbent. And the first phone call I got election night was from Tom. Now we're ready to support you. In the meantime, a third of the district is in the Black community. This is still close enough to Vietnam that a lot of people in the Black community knew people who'd been in the military, and they did not like Tom Hayden. And one of my first supporters there said to me, listen, Ruth, if you let that guy anywhere near your campaign, we will not support you. So I had to say to Tom when he called to say, now we'll support, I said, thank you very much. Please don't. I cannot have you on.
Was he shocked?
Well, he basically thought I was kidding. But so I had to keep telling him, stay out of it. You're going to cost me the election. And then after I got knifed, he was still on the horizon. So I had to get somebody else to do it. And well, after I was elected, another assemblyman in whose campaign I had helped before I ran for office told me that Tom was claiming credit for my win.
Wow.
So
amazing. The world of politics, and you really are articulate and concise. I appreciate this, Ruth. But it's like I asked Tom all these same questions too one time. So Utah Phillips says,
I can't hear you if I can't.
Yeah, I'm sorry. Utah Phillips says anarchy is making rules for yourself and not other people. Who's entitled to make the rules?
Depends what the rules are for.
Yeah.
I mean, you can't, the real purpose of electing people, I don't know why nobody talks about this anymore. It's both in terms of making laws and taxes. The purpose of electing people to some office or other, whether it's a homeowners association or a city or the nation, is to collectivize the authority, your authority and everybody else's authority, to make the decision so that you don't have however many 100 million we are, separate sets of rules. Somebody's got to create a certain level of uniformity. And that's why you should pay attention to who you vote for.
Yeah.
I mean, on the tax issue, as long as I have a forum, I did warn you at the beginning, you give a
please go. Forum. This is what it is.
Taxes are a collective investment.
Yeah.
And I don't know why that is so rarely articulated. Everybody says, I don't want to pay any taxes. Oh, really? Did you want to fly in an airplane? Did you want to know that it's safe? Did you want to drive to work on a road? I mean, some investment decisions cannot be made individually. You can't decide you should have clean water and I decide you shouldn't. I mean, somebody's got to collectively act on behalf of in how to invest the public money.
Yeah.
And if you look at taxes as collective investment, they look different when you think of them as a penalty.
Yeah. That's a good point. And this word freedom is etymologically the same as what Utah Phillips says anarchy is, making one's own rules for one's own self. That's what freedom comes from etymologically. So what does freedom mean to you now?
Your freedom stops at my safety.
Yeah.
Or at my freedom.
Yeah.
So If you don't want to have an abortion, don't have one. It's none of your business whether I have an abortion.
Yeah.
You want to have a baby? That's great. If I don't want to have a baby, it's none of your damn business.
Yeah. What's the difference between rights and responsibilities?
They are symbiotic.
Yeah.
I mean, in my health law days, when I was writing the newsletter, the lawyers explained to me very effectively that rights don't mean anything by themselves. So it was very fashionable then to have a patient's bill of rights. And the patient's bill of rights would be posted in the hospital or the clinic, and it starts off, you have the right to be treated with courtesy. Doesn't mean anything unless it says the staff here is obligated to treat you with courtesy.
Yeah.
So we get carried away easily or deflected easily from recognizing the symbiosis. You can't have rights without somebody's rights depends on somebody's responsibilities.
Really well done. And so what's the difference between rebellion and revolution?
That one depends who you ask.
Well, let me tell you what I heard. Rebellion is people realize something's wrong. Revolution is there's something wrong and here's a new plan, re-evolve.
Would be nice if that were often the case.
Yeah.
I just, we're going to go back to something we said at the beginning.
Yeah.
Are people thinking?
Yeah.
When you say, what are they thinking? Are they thinking? Yeah. It's well, in my experience, it's really easy for people to what they call analyze, but that doesn't, they're usually very limited in what constitutes analyzing. So I also had, there's a Ruth's rule for just about everything, and or an aphorism. One of them is started early in my counsel career. I too used to believe in conspiracies until I discovered incompetence. It's so easy for people to say those nasty bastards that what they're planning is blah blah blah. That assumes they're planning.
Yeah.
Mostly they're just reacting.
That is amazing. They're just reacting.
Sometimes reacting is good.
Yeah.
I mean, somebody's putting a knife in your head, scratching him is a good thing. That's just a reaction.
There's a socialist who said, where the people fear the government, you have tyranny. Where the government fears the people, you have liberty. That's John Basil Barnhill. In 2005, the film V for Vendetta paraphrased it. People should not be afraid of their governments. Governments should be afraid of their people. Now, my question is how do you personally handle false fears? The war on poverty, the war on terrorism, or the classic is the war on drugs. You can't have a war on drugs because drugs don't fight, and you can't say no to drugs because drugs don't talk. So this idea of false fears, how do you personally handle it?
Well, this goes back to, are people really thinking? Or, I mentioned the business of understanding that people's fear of change. But mostly people don't articulate a fear of change. And mostly, I think all of us fail to recognize that it's just a fear of change or fear of the unknown.
Yeah.
So, but there are specific things it makes sense to be afraid of. Addiction, guns, tyranny of various sorts, other people directing your life. I mean, you'll have to forgive my falling back on political stories, but
Don't. That's what I'm here for. Believe
well,
me.
I've had I'm still trying to figure out what they thought was going to happen, but I have a couple of stories where somebody tried to threaten me politically, not physically, but one of them came. There's a whole bunch of people who basically support themselves by suing developers and government agencies, and they have it's a racket basically, and it's very successful. None of them has to get a real job. So one of these women who's been suing over everything environmental for years, and as far as I know, has been fired from every uh, what might have been a real job that I know of. Um, she's been around ever since DreamWorks was going to come to Playa Vista and then didn't. So one day in my office, I got my assistant says, Don Henley called you up, the musician. He wants a meeting. I said, really? What does he want a meeting about? She said, he didn't say. I said, okay, give him a meeting. So since I don't know what it's about, I don't know which of my staff to have meet with him. So right before 9 o'clock or whatever time his meeting was, this woman from who sues all the time shows up, and I said, oh, hello, what are you doing here? She said, oh, I'm here for the meeting. Oh, I said, well, come on in. A few minutes later, Henley shows up. We bring him in. So now there's the three of us and nobody from my staff. I have no witnesses. I'm so sorry. It was a great show, but there were no witnesses. So Henley says to me, I said, well, it's nice to see you, Mr. Henley. What can I do for you? And he says, well, Marcia here, you may remember that when you first ran, I supported you. I said, yes, you did. And I gave you a contribution. I said, yes, you did, $500. I believe I thanked you at the time, but if not, thank you again. Now, what can I do for you? And he says, well, Marcia here tells me you're not being very cooperative. So I wait. And he says, so I'm here to tell you that if you don't start doing what she asks of you, I'm going to run against you. And I said, from Texas? And he said to me, I guess I wasn't supposed to know that. He said to me, well, I still have my house here. I said, oh, well, best of luck. I guess I'll see you at the polls. I did not tell him his house was not in my district, but I'll see you in the polls. Anything else I can do for you? No. So they got up and left.
Yeah.
And I thought this was absolutely hysterical. I went running around the office saying, you'll never guess, you'll never guess. And to this day, I cannot figure out what they expected me to do or say. I have no idea. Another one was in one of my re-election campaigns, probably the third one. There were four. The third or fourth one, there was an issue where an organization that takes care of little babies, infants up to 6 months old, born addicted. And they lost their lease on wherever they were in Santa Monica. They were coming to Delray. So the neighbors, of course, went batshit over this because that's what you do. Something. It was a former industrial building. I have no idea. Nobody knows what was built there. It was some clandestine operation, been vacant for a while. And they're going to put in a facility that will house these little babies. So I am summoned to a community meeting, a homeowners association, and they explained to me why this is a terrible idea and it's a threat to their neighborhood. What's the threat? Well, we don't want, we're going to have needles on our front lawns. I said, these kids can't even sit up yet. What are you talking about? Well, it's not the kids, it's their parents. Their parents are not involved. Well, we can't have this. And if you insist on doing that, I think I'm confusing two events. If you insist on doing this, you're going to lose the election. And I say to them, no, it was the same one. I say to them, I'm not going to lose the election. But if I lose the election because I stuck up for innocent babies, it's okay with me. I didn't lose the election.
Wow.
I don't know what they expect. And then when I got moved in, I mentioned earlier being reapportioned and shipped out to the other end of the city. One of the lobbyists told me that he wouldn't tell me who it was, but somebody who worked for one of the, I guess, new council members said, she's going to quit. And his response was, you don't know her very well, do you? And so I didn't quit. It was hard on my staff because they had to commute a long way. But basically, it was exciting. It was very satisfying because these were people who really needed help and we could help them.
Wow. Beautiful. So, Ruth, this kind of leads perfectly into something I've learned from studying McLuhan and James Joyce is how do you turn a breakdown into a breakthrough or a rejection into a redirection? So how you learn from these threats. And it's Moshe Feldenkrais says that, he works with movement and healing. He says it's literally possible to identify a weakness and incorporate it to become a strength rather than we're normally taught to overcome a weakness. Tell me a weakness you turned into a strength.
Well, it depends on whether you would call it a weakness or not.
Yeah.
But when I was starting as a candidate, I had no idea how to behave. As I mentioned, I had never planned to run for office.
Yeah.
I'm not very patient. It's gotten worse as I got older, although my mother said I was always like this. And I was very shy as a child.
Yeah.
I'm the kid who would get physically ill if I had to be in a class play.
Yeah.
I couldn't bear having to get up in front of groups of people, although it turns out I could get cornered into it, but because I did have to do that once. Part of the reason I thought it would be good for me to run, even though I was going to lose, is so that I could learn skills I didn't have, but that I would need in any future career, specifically how to work a room. And so I learned how to work a room, and now it's so automatic that if I go to anything where I think somebody has a vague idea who I used to be, I work the room. Just go around and say hello to people. That was I can't think of the word, but basically it was one of those things where, look, if you're going to do this, you're going to have to learn how to do X.
Yeah. It's a really good example. What's more important, conviction or compromise?
What was the first one?
Conviction.
Well, you have to have something from which to compromise. Seems to me you can't get along really well in life without some of both.
Yeah. Louis Buñuel says, I'm for anyone who seeks the truth, but I part ways when they claim they found it. Now, 90%, 99%.
Me too.
99% of people go, that I agree. That one person said, no, that's bullshit. Because if I'm going to seek something, it's because I want to find it. So I morphed it into, the cliche goes, the journey is more important than the destination. Why do we have to name or seek a destination if the journey is more important?
Why should we? I wouldn't bother.
That's it. You're right. Because that's the flaneurs in Paris in the 20s, psychogeography. These guys, just like as Joyce said, epiphanies and everydayness,
My view of all that is, why are you wasting your time defining things? Why not do something? Okay, now Joyce wrote, so, he produced books. So he has an answer to that question. But
it's, and he got it from.
let me tell you.
Oh, sorry.
Let me tell you about political science, for example.
Yeah.
God, what a waste of everybody's. Well, that's an exaggeration. But somehow I managed to avoid social sciences, and boy, am I glad I did. studying something. Well, you know the old saying, those who can do and those who
Yeah.
can't teach. I would modify that. Those who can maybe do and those who can't study.
Yeah.
They may also teach. But I had, you know, I knew all these people in college who were involved in one movement thing or another, and many of them wound up as sociology professors. And sometime early in my council tenure, I was at a New Year's weekend gathering with a bunch of them in Santa Barbara, and one guy whom I had known in college says to me, "Have you read Harvey's book?" I also knew Harvey in college. And I said, "No, what's Harvey's book?" And he says, "It's about local, these are sociology professors, both of them. It's about
Harvey, what's his last name?
Molich."
Okay, go ahead, sir.
Very nice guy. I remember him from Ann Arbor. I liked him. He's now a sociology professor, along with Dick Flax, who was a year or two ahead of us. So Dick says, "Have you read Harvey's book?" I said, "No, what's Harvey's book?" And he said, "It's about local government." Harvey's an expert in local government. And I said, "Dick, I'm an expert in local government." That was the moment, that was a big breakthrough for me. Just to be able, because these were guys I revered when I was younger.
Wow.
And so then I had a very interesting conversation with Harvey a few hours later, who said to me, "I have a great idea for you for a council motion." Okay, what's that? He says, "You should have the council pass an ordinance that in public restrooms there have to be 3 times as many toilets for women as for men." So I said, "Okay, it's Harvey. He's a nice guy." So I said, "No." And he said, "What do you mean, no?" And I said, "Well, I'm doing something I think is more important." "What could be more important?" I said, "Making sure there's water to flush any toilets." At which point he had the grace to say, "You know, I don't really understand what your job is." And I said, "Call me anytime. I love to talk about it." Did he ever call? No.
Wow. What you said there for a second was what one of the main influences on Joyce was Mallarmé, the symbolist poet. He says, "To define is to kill, to suggest is to create."
See, you know, you may like all those aphorisms. They bore me to tears.
Well, that's good, because that's what the point of aphorisms is, to let it infect you if you can, but then reword it or reinvent it or take it farther or ask a question. That's what I'm saying. Challenge it. So in your accomplishments, how would you rate these 3 elements: luck, skill, and ambition? What played the biggest role, second and third?
I don't think ambition played much
Yeah.
role, except sort of accidental. I mean, by the time I was in college, what I wanted was, my ambition was to be good enough at something that people would call up and something would come up and people would say, "We need Ruth."
Yeah.
That's fairly modest as ambitions go, I think.
Yeah.
I've thought until recently that luck was far and away the most significant factor, and
Really?
it is a significant factor. Everything in my life has been a surprise to me, but I'm realizing, because I happen to be reflecting on it, because I'm trying to write a memoir finally, that it turns out I actually have a whole lot of skills that I thought everybody had.
Yeah.
And it turns out they don't.
Yeah.
One of the movement heavies, bless his heart, said to me long after our SDS days, said to me one day, "You know, I could never do what you do." And I thought about that for a while, and I decided he was right. He could not have done what I did, just as I couldn't have done what he did.
Yeah.
And that was a big awakening for me, that there are skills involved in this, and they are unfortunately lacking in a lot of my successors. And I still don't know why, because you can learn how to listen to people. you can learn, I think you can learn how to think on your feet. Somebody was quoted recently as in the middle of a campaign speech. Somebody said something about the police, and she said, "Fuck the police." You don't do that. You know, I mean,
Name calling doesn't work.
that's not very skillful.
Yeah.
Well, she lost the election. So,
You know, I love Lenny Bruce saying there's three things you can call cops: cops, pigs, and peace officers. My thing is, why not call them peace officers? Because it's William Blake. We become what we behold. So, you know, let's call them peace officers.
Lenny Bruce actually said that.
Yeah, well, he didn't add the William Blake part.
But
he
I mean,
said the three things.
Yeah, that's interesting.
It's very interesting. Yeah. And so is perception reality?
Frequently.
That's
but not always.
Anger can be a productive emotion when fill in the blank.
I'm sorry, say it again.
Anger can be a productive emotion when fill in the blank.
Almost anything.
Yeah.
When threatened, verbally or physically,
What's the most significant difference between men and women, physical aside?
I used to think it was ego. Now I think I've now met enough women with big enough and misplaced enough egos to interfere with that difference. But I think it changes over time. I mean, you know, in the late lamented 50s, which I do not lament for a minute. I hated the 50s. That's the era when girls, if sent to college at all, were sent to college to get their MRS degree. And we were taught growing up that subservience to men was a good idea because blah, blah, blah. Yeah. I think the differences change over time. They're cultural.
Yeah.
They're heavily influenced by things like education.
What caused matriarchy?
What caused
matriarchy?
Somebody has to feed the children.
Very good, because you know if you read the Venice Beachhead a couple issues ago, I had this big essay about can art stop war, and it was basically around Maria Gimbutas and Rianne Eisler, Chalice and the Blade, saying matristic civilization. That's what we're after. The nourishing, that we're probably more hardwired to be cooperative than hardwired to fight and have war. But most people think we're hardwired to have war.
You know, like, here's why I think you should not try to make generalizations.
Like that.
And all those statements are. Have you ever read the play Lysistrata, which I'm told is pronounced Lysistrata?
Yeah, the Lysistrata.
Okay. Go ahead. So I read it in high school in that English class with the gentleman who told me. And what I remember about it at the age of 16 or 17 was being so impressed. The women stopped the war.
Yeah.
Where can you point to examples of somebody actually stopping a war? So that's 1959 that I read this play. 40 years later, more than 40 years later, I'm in the city council and I have a young woman who comes to work for me, and she has a PhD in women's studies. And she's my press deputy. So if there's a press call, she has to take it and she has to write it all down and tell me whether she thinks I should do the interview or whatever it is. So one morning I'm listening to the radio or open the paper or something, and there's a story about the Lysistrata project, which I don't know if you remember this. They were going to have a week or a month of readings of this play as an anti-war activity. And I think, wow, that's cool. I wonder how I can get involved in that. So I drive downtown to City Hall, and I'm greeted by my press deputy, who says, the PhD in women's studies, who says to me, you got a call from something called the Lysistrata Project, and they want you to do this, and I recommend you not do it. And I looked at her.
Not do it.
Not do it. I said, why not? And she said, well, the women's movement says Lysistrata is a very sexist play. It's all about how women are good for nothing but sex. And I said to her, remember, it's always good to ask questions. I said, have you read this play? And she said, certainly not. I said, well, I have read this play, which I'm sure she didn't expect. And that's not what it says at all. They stopped a war. And so tell them, yes, I'd be delighted to participate. Have I changed your mind? No. Okay. Then my tenure ends. We all leave and go on with our lives. And I have a guest gig at Loyola Marymount, and I meet a newly minted PhD in women's studies. So I said, oh, goody. I say, I have to ask you a question. And I tell her the story and say, so is this for real that the women? Oh, yes. So I said, have you read the play? No.
Oh, no. Oh.
Anyway,
yeah. Well, I'm glad that we did this interview, that we didn't have a press secretary in between us, because I really appreciate your time. I'm learning a lot, Ruth, and this has been delightful. But I have a few more if you can go a little longer.
I knew you would.
There's a line that goes, what's it? That's, you create what you resist. Bob Goldthwait, the comedian, says, you are what you hate. James Joyce said, it's a curious thing how your mind is super saturated with the religion in which you say you disbelieve. And Louis Buñuel said, thank God I'm an atheist. So the basic question is, any thoughts on this? You create what you resist. I'm not saying you, Ruth, but one creates what one resists. Any thoughts on that?
You know, I actually don't think so.
Yeah.
I can't think of one.
That's all right.
It's not often somebody reduces me to speechlessness. So congratulations.
That's all right. How do you find peace of mind?
Well, I spend a lot of time in revenge fantasies.
Revenge fantasy. Wow.
Yes, I have never done any of them. I don't expect ever to do them. The one I really do want to, well, I don't really. If I did, I'd have done it by now. But I have a long list. I went through a period, I'm going through it again, where lots of people I know die in relatively rapid succession for all different reasons. And at one point, maybe 20 or 25 years ago, when there was this whole spate of these, I was really shaken up by it. And, you know, I would just get over one and somebody'd call to tell me somebody else died. So finally, I decided as a coping mechanism, I was going to make a list of people who, if they died, I wouldn't care.
Yeah.
So I did. Yeah. And then one of them died. It was very upsetting.
Wow.
It was upsetting for several reasons. One is it's hard, just like, you know, when you're a little kid and your parent dies, you feel like you did it somehow.
Yeah.
But so I felt a little like I did it. But the worst part was I really didn't care.
Yeah.
And I didn't like that response to
Yeah.
myself. Then, as I was leaving, remember, they tried to move me across town, so I'd quit. And they were all generally the new bunch who came in as term limits was saying I would. They made very clear they didn't like me. I'm not clear what they didn't like, but whatever it was, they didn't like me. So I didn't like them much either. And then I have a bunch of other people I've dealt with over the years. So I decided the next time that I don't really want to kill anybody.
No.
But there's some people I would like to have die.
Yeah.
And the way to do that is in a murder mystery.
Yeah.
So I started to write one. And I got hung up with whether this one particular guy should be a victim or the perpetrator. And I quit writing.
That should be the novel. You writing, that's called Manipian satire. You write the novel of you trying to write that, and that's where you stop. That's a great punchline. Well, these are 5 quick Alan Watts questions off the top of your head in just a couple words. So, 1, who started it all?
I would love to know the answer to that. I want someone to tell me what was there before the Big Bang.
Well, I can tell you what Frank Zappa was on his way out, and his buddy Captain Beefheart was in the same state, and they both had watched the PBS special on the Big Bang Theory. And Frank says, Don, what was before the Big Bang? And Don said, the big. Okay, second Alan Watts. Are we going to make it?
Make what?
Good. Answering a question with a question. 3, where do we put it?
That one conjures up many fantasies and many answers.
4, who's cleaning it up?
Nobody, unfortunately.
5, is it serious?
Yes.
Wow. Few more and we're out of here. If you were walking down the street today.
Can I also tell you I have never read Alan Watts?
Well, that's fine. Yeah. I mean, he's actually, I think Alan Watts is more important to listen to. But he's on the radio every Sunday and every Thursday, and he's been dead for many years. So it's sort of, anyways, whatever. If you were walking down the street today and you met yourself as a 12-year-old, what would you say to your 12-year-old self?
Grow up.
Grow up. Well, this one's close to what you're doing. If a publisher was to release your autobiography off the top of your head, what would the title be?
I've had a title and I keep changing it. So.
Yeah.
No, I have opening sentences. I'm not sure I have a title. The closest to a title I don't like, which is The Accidental Politician. But that's cribbed from, there was a book called The Accidental Tourist.
Yeah.
No, my opening line, I think I mentioned it earlier, would be, I come by all my eccentricities genetically.
Genetically, wow. They want to scent the glue in the binding of your book. What smell?
What smell? It shouldn't have a smell.
No smell. That's good. Tell me something good you never had and you never want.
Something good I never had was a father when I was a teenager.
It's good you never had it, but you never want it?
Oh, no, of course I want it.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. It's good you never had it, but you never want it.
Writing a dissertation.
There you go.
I actually had a friend tell me once, when I was one of my periods of groping around, what should I do with my life? So one of the health activists said to me, I think you should get a PhD.
Yeah.
And I looked at him and I thought, geez, I so don't want to get a PhD. And I looked, but I mean, he meant well. He's a friend. And I said, you mean so I'd know what I was talking about? And he said, yes. At which point I thought, boy, are you off track?
Well, that's sort of Alan Watts. Everybody's searching about find out who they are. If you find out who you are, you're fucked. So, I mean, it's this whole thing. And that's funny. I'll ask you this one because...
No, that's not true.
Yeah.
As I have in my 9th decade started to find out a lot more about who I am, I like me a lot better.
There you go.
I am much happier being me than I was before I figured a lot of this stuff out.
That's another one I'll slip in. This is McLuhan and Krishnamurti say, violence is the human search for identity.
That's a horrible thought.
That's horrible.
There's got to be a better way to search for identity.
How do we stop our governments from going to war?
Well, you're about to start me off on another whole hobby horse. People often ask me, especially when I'm explaining why ethics reform and ethics commissions basically are shuck and a jive. And they say, well, how would we How would we ensure better government? And the answer is, in all of these things, people you want to trust to run your government, to speak for you as part of this collective, mostly won't run. You have to be able to persuade people or create the conditions in which the people you would trust to be in charge are willing to step up and be in charge. And that usually ends the conversation right there. I mean, my first year in office, uh, still fresh out of the hospital, I can't talk really well. First year, people said to me, "Well, how does it feel to be so important?" Second year, people said to me, "You having any fun?" And the third year and ever since, people said I wouldn't have your job for anything. Why not? Well, I thought they were going to say I couldn't bear raising money. But what they all say is I couldn't stand the um, nastiness.
They couldn't stand the
Yeah, that's why
nastiness.
they wouldn't run for office. It's so nasty. It's
Right,
so, there's another word for it too. But
right.
um, so the lesson for the rest of us is, and this really is related to the thing about going to war and all the rest of it. Um, Many people, most people I know of, think the way to talk to your government officials is to scream at them
Yeah,
or to, be very nasty and
yeah,
call them names. Well, what does that get you?
yeah.
Nothing. But it is like going to war for no reason. In this memoir I'm writing, I have somewhere thrown in a sentence that happens in my life all the time. I now understand that people would rather be mad than solve the problem, but I do not understand why.
Yeah. Boy, that's a lot there. How has being government, what would you say? You've been a politician, right? A politician. How has being a politician shaped your behavior?
Well, I have learned sometimes it's best to say nothing at all. Uh, I, it's hard to, there's a chicken and egg problem here
Yeah.
too. I did have one experience years ago when my uncle died. My mother and I went to the memorial, and we were early. So I went wandering around. This was at the Ethical Culture Society, where both my mother and my uncle had been founding members. And when I was in the hospital after the attack, my mother came out at 83 years old, came out on a moment's notice, stayed with me for several months. And she was, I mean, you can only imagine what it's like after the number of losses she'd had in her life to have her daughter attacked at this stage was really pretty awful. But she felt, you would feel really helpless, except she felt better because I got credit for they had to give me several pints of blood, and we got credit on the bill for the blood donations my mother had made through the Ethical Culture Society. So she felt like she participated in my recovery. So a year or two later, I'm back at my uncle's memorial and have nothing to do for half an hour or an hour until everybody else shows up. So I went wandering around, and everybody from the society I saw, I thanked for the blood donations. And when I finally got back upstairs, my mother said, "What did you say to those ladies?" I said, "What do you mean?" She said, "Three of them came over to tell me how wonderful you are." I said, "I just thanked them for the blood donations." "How did you know to do that?" I said, "Mother, I'm a politician." She looked at me and she said, "Well, you didn't used to be."
Oh, wow.
So in there somewhere is
That's
they
your
are.
shaping of behavior. Isn't that is a beautiful story? So well put. So what's a cultural shift you see developing today that inspires you?
Oh, I wish I saw one that inspired
Do
me.
you know how many times I get that answer now? Well, is there one you can kind of
That you know, at my age, I feel like there are only a few things left for me to do that are remotely productive. One
Yeah.
of them is, to the extent that anybody wants to learn from me, to transfer whatever I have learned.
Yeah.
Some people want to know, and a lot of people couldn't care less.
Yeah.
So that's part of writing a memoir. Another is to pay myself back for all the angst and physical suffering and the emotional suffering, and take advantage of isn't the right phrase exactly, but to appreciate
Yeah.
what the blessings I have had. I have
Yeah.
been in many ways unlucky, and in other ways incredibly
Yeah.
lucky. And it seems to me I owe all those who contributed to that, including myself,
Yeah.
to enjoy it while I still can.
Beautiful. I just have a couple more. I want to check this.
You keep saying that.
Oh, okay. Well, here we
That's all
go.
right.
Yeah.
Oh, match you hour for hour.
Four more, actually, I got. Okay, so this is a long intro, but I won't do it. It's basically, is archiving more innate or more invented? And do you have plans for your own archive? Because isn't life, the point of life, to live in the moment, be here now? Why do we have to collect all this stuff? I know history's important. You learn it. We're both studied persons. We appreciate academia to a point. And you said it earlier, study. I love that word, study, and research and think and suss out, critical thinking. But if the point of life is to live in the moment, then why do we have to collect all this stuff?
Well, we don't. Well, which stuff are you talking about?
Yeah, well, that's what it goes to you personally. Do you have an archive of all your history that you're digging into to write your memoirs, or is it all in your head?
At the moment, it's all in my head.
Wow.
I do have, well, I've been telling these stories for years, but I do have, the city maintains files.
They have your
So
archive.
they have,
Yeah.
well, they have a
Some
lot
of
of it.
Some of it.
I kept duplicates of some stuff that I don't know what to do with.
Yeah.
And look, everybody I know who's my age and who has done anything is now facing, what do I do with all this stuff? There's a bunch of stuff that is, something my mother bought in Europe in 1930, whatever it was, or something. So that's one set of things.
Yeah.
The some of my Coastal Commission era files got trashed by someone who borrowed them and loaned them then to somebody else who threw them out. So I don't have those. I have shelves full of documents, campaign literature. I have no idea what to do with them.
Yeah.
The people I still know through the SDS days are full of discussion about who wants an archive.
Well, some colleges must.
Yeah, well, the Briscoe Center at Austin apparently is one of them. That's the one that keeps coming up. I don't have a bunch of stuff from the SDS days.
Yeah.
Because I couldn't stand all those documents. I was invited to go to Port Huron by my then boyfriend. I said, well, what are you going to do there? And he said, we're going to hammer out a manifesto. I said, have a nice weekend. Even then, I couldn't stand meetings.
Yeah.
So, no, I don't know. I mean, at the moment, it seems that just at a personal level, I have the sense that not enough people care about what went before.
Yeah.
But if they do care, it's not clear to me how best to communicate it.
Yeah. Well, I would love to have you come and speak, because Venice Heritage Museum is young people researching and preserving Venice history. And it's really been fun, because I've done 6 salons there where we talk about Venice culture and issues. And they're preserving this stuff, and it's not a big group, but there are an interested group, and that's what I like, several people sitting
So
around.
the people that I have known over the years who really shaped a lot of Venice history, you probably knew a lot of them too. Most of them are dead.
Yeah, but we have people carrying it on. We have documents, we have films, we have all kinds of
So
things.
do you know about the Venice Archive at Long Beach State?
Well, you mean Arnold's?
Yeah.
Oh, of course.
Oh,
Yeah.
okay. Just
I know.
check it.
That's very important.
But I have a story about that too.
Go ahead.
So one day Arnold asked me for some campaign stuff or something. So I gave it to him and I said, "What do you do with all this stuff?" And he said, "I give it to John A. House." And I went, goggle-eyed at him. I said, "My John A. House?" He said, "Who's your John A. House?" He grew up in the apartment next door to me in New York. Our doors were about this far apart. And he's just enough older. He's since died, but he's just enough older than I.
Yeah.
And he's a boy and I'm a girl. So
Yeah.
we didn't spend any time together as children. I knew his parents and his dog better than I knew him. But of course, it's my John A. House. And so I was too shy to call him. This is even after my tenure, I'm the councilwoman. I was too shy to call him up. I can't believe it. And I feel terrible about that because when my mother was still alive, she would have loved meeting him again. His father was a pediatrician. If I got sick and, she didn't have time to call my pediatrician, Dr. A House would come in and dose me. And there he was all these years later. We were at least in our 60s when we met again. And it was lovely.
Yeah.
So that's what I know about Arnold's. So
Yeah.
John was the archivist at
Yeah.
Long Beach State and later at SC.
Yeah.
But Arnold, Mo, did you know Mo?
I know the name, but
yeah. See, Mo was one of the people who got me to run. And
what's Mo's last name?
Stavnezer, Stavnezer.
Yeah. But we can do. Let's maybe have you come to one of our salons and just talk. It's real casual and easy. What's a question that remains unresolved for you?
Well, the biggest question is why.
Simple.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, that's good. Okay. This is Thornton Wilder in 1928. Art is confession. Art is the secret told. But art is not only the desire to tell one's secret, it's the desire to tell it and hide it at the same time.
I like that.
You've laid your cards on the table for a good hour and a half more. What's it really all about for you?
That's the why question.
Yeah.
My thing in life is solving problems.
Yeah.
It's not analyzing.
Yeah.
I once had to tell one of my really good staff members. First, I explained to her the first paper she wrote for me, issue paper. I said, "This is really good, Erica, except I need you to do one thing. I need you to put the last sentence up in front in case I don't have time to read the whole thing." She sort of huffed out. Okay, all right, so she comes the next week or a few days later, she comes stomping into my office. This is a wonderful woman. Comes stomping into my office, leans on my desk and says, "I figured out why I write the way I write instead of the way you told me to." "Oh," I said, "why?" Ruth's question, "Why is that?" She said, "I was a philosophy major." And I can't tell you how much I enjoyed saying to her, "Get over it."
That is so good.
And some years later, after she'd left the staff and she was running a family wine bar, I think it was nearby, I went to an event there and I asked her if she remembered this, and she said, "Oh yeah, I remember that. That's what I tell all my staff now. I tell them how to write a memo." Yes, she was willing to learn it.
I'd love to hear your reaction to this before the last question. I promise. This is Marcel
A likely
Duchamp.
story.
This is Marcel Duchamp. Any reaction? He says, "There's no solution because there's no problem."
He's wrong. He's at least half wrong.
He's half wrong.
There's a problem. There are problems with no solution.
Yeah.
But there are a lot of problems where there is a solution if people are willing to knuckle down and approach exactly what is the problem. The Venice canals.
Yeah.
You remember the Venice canals? The sidewalks were officially closed to the public in 1950 something because they were crumbling. And for the next 5 decades, I think, no, I'm off a little bit. Anyway, for the next several decades, there was this long series of local battles and lawsuits, and largely between landlords and tenants, and goes on and on. Anyway, so I take office. By the time I take office, my predecessor has gotten a plan together to restore the canals. The homeowners will pay half of it. The city will pay half of it. And the city, at her instigation, the city has already granted permits for this thing. But they still have to get a permit from the Coastal Commission. And suddenly she's not the council rep anymore. I'm the council rep. So we put it off for a while. And one day, Jim Bickhart, another longtime Venetian you should talk to, says to me, "We can't put it off any longer. We have to meet with the canal people." So we go and have a meeting with the canal people. And in preparation, I call a friend who works at the Coastal Commission and say, "Tell me what I need to know." And she says, "You can't get a permit for vertical walls." She was great. She could go, she's dead too. She would go right to the point. So I said, "Why not?" And she explained to me that the Venice canals were not only a federally designated historical monument, they were also, can you believe this, a federally designated wetland. Why were they a wetland? Because those walls that were crumbling, that had all the weeds and stuff growing in them, were a foraging area for the California least tern, an endangered species of bird that nests on Venice Beach. So you cannot have vertical concrete walls. You have to have walls that replace the habitat. Okay, I say, and off I go to meet with the screaming hordes of canal homeowners who are very upset because they want vertical walls, except a little faction of them. There were like, I didn't get very many votes at the canals. So I explain, I still can't talk. So I have a little microphone thing. 7 people in a row asked me the same question. "Are you going to get us the vertical walls?" 7 people get the answer. "No, I'm not. We can't get a permit for vertical walls." Back and forth. Finally, I got a little tired of it. And I said, "Look, you can tell me that you disagree with me. I understand that. I've got that message. You cannot tell me you're surprised. This is why none of you voted for me." And there's this gasp in the room. Apparently, I wasn't supposed to know that. Well, my campaign, politicians speak this language. Nobody with any sense does, but there's something called crosstabs, which is an index, precinct by precinct, of how many votes each person got. And so you look at the crosstabs, and in the canals, she won. I lost. And why was that? Because I wasn't going to commit to vertical walls for which you cannot get a permit. So I said to them, "Look, you can't tell me you're surprised. This is why none of you voted for it. Let's get together and work out a solution." They would not talk to me for 2 years.
Wow.
Until somebody named Galanter, I love this, spelled like mine, but with a Y instead of an ER, calls me up and he says, I'm the new president of the Canal Homeowners. Can we talk? I said, where have you been all my life? Come on in. So Mark came in and I explained the problem and I said, look, I don't know why they won't talk to me, but we have to find a solution with sloping walls and weeds in it.
Yeah.
So we worked out how to do that. And I said, all right, I'll call the Coastal Conservancy, which I did. And I knew the homeowners would hate it on principle. I mean, this is Venice. You live here, it's a religion here. We do not agree.
Yeah.
Doesn't matter what it is. There's us and there's them.
Yeah.
So, of course, they didn't like it. I said, okay, fine, you come up with a solution. So they did.
Wow.
And so I have a wonderful picture of Mark as the gondolier and me as the passenger poling through the restored canal.
Restored, beautiful.
But it took,
yeah,
that's why I know people would rather be mad than solve the problem.
It's amazing. What gives you the most optimism?
Optimism? Every once in a while, I run into younger people who are interested in learning, they're interested in learning what you can do and what you have to watch out for.
Yeah.
But I'm not sure there are a lot of people teaching them. And I'm this year, I guess, I have a new thing. Since I left city government, I've had a couple of different academic part-time gigs. My current one is being a mentor to 2 graduate students, one in social work and one in urban planning.
Yeah.
And the urban planning one, I know why she got assigned to me, but I asked the social work student, how did you happen to get paired with me? And she said, well, I'm interested in advocacy. Glad to hear it.
Great.
So, and then a friend of mine, the woman who ran my office at the end of my tenure, has a daughter who has worked as a domestic violence counselor for years, decided there's a problem, an unmet need. All these people in shelters can't get any services. So she's cooked up a business that she's got a state grant to operate, and she has a mobile medical unit, medical and psychological treatment unit that moves around and will provide services to women and children living in shelters. That gives me hope.
Beautiful. The first question, Ruth, is what is the best thing for a human being? Wilhelm Reich said the best thing for a human being is another human being. And the last question, what gives you the most optimism, is what they asked Groucho Marx at the end of his life. And he said, other people. So it's sure been fun spending this time with another person, especially because of you. Thank you so much. Well, really fun.
Thank you for having me. As I told you at the beginning, you give a politician a microphone and we're off.
Well, it's a microphone, it's television, telephone. So thank you so much. And even though I'm going to hit this end broadcast button, I hope this never ends and we can keep talking forever.